Hello everybody and welcome back. As promised last time, we're going to pick up this time with the relatively commonplace sounding terms of our legislative powers, executive power, and judicial power. Now, as said, they are all technically terms of art, although they appear to be very simple. But unfortunately, a lot of people today, and this isn't really, I'm not criticizing, so it's more like I'm lamenting, and I hope to change this, but it seems that a lot of people lack the basic philosophical and political ideas and underpinnings of just what these powers are and how they're meant to be used. So it's good to start with the basics. As a forewarning, there are going to be two relatively lengthy excerpts that I take, one from Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, and Federalist number 47. But I think that they sum up very nicely exactly what is contained within the nature of the powers just mentioned. First, the foremost principle behind dividing government into three branches comes from Baron de Montesquieu, who was a French political philosopher. And this idea has come to be called the separation of powers. We've all heard that phrase before, or at least most of us have. It can also be called checks and balances. The main text concerning this nearly catechetical political doctrine is found in Chapter 5 of Book 11 in his work, The Spirit of the Laws, where he says, quote, "In each state there are three sorts of powers: legislative power, executive power over those things depending on the right of nations, and executive power over those things depending on civil right. By the first, the prince or magistrate makes laws for a time or for always, and corrects or abrogates those that have been made. By the second, he makes peace or war, sends or receives embassies, establishes security, and prevents invasions. By the third, he punishes crimes or judges disputes between individuals. The last will be called the power of judging, and the former simply the executive power of the state. Political liberty in a citizen is that tranquility of spirit which comes from the opinion which one has of his security, and in order for him to have this liberty, the government must be such that one citizen cannot fear another citizen. When legislative power is united with executive power in a single person or in a single body of the magistracy, that governing body, there is no liberty, because one can fear that the same monarch or senate that makes tyrannical laws will execute them tyrannically. Nor is there liberty if the power of judging is not separate from legislative power and from executive power. If it were joined to legislative power, the power over the life and liberty of the citizens would be arbitrary, for the judge would be the legislator. If it were joined to the executive power, the judge could have the force of an oppressor. All would be lost if the same man or the same body of principal men, either of nobles or of the people, exercised these three powers: that of making the laws, that of executing public resolutions, and that of judging the crimes or the disputes of individuals." End quote. Montesquieu was clear, saying that the unification of any two or all of those three major powers of the state leaves great potential for tyranny to arise. Now, the founders in America clearly read this passage from Montesquieu at one point or another, and did not take this principle of the separation of powers lightly at all. However, did they believe that this separation was absolute? The answer is of course no. Besides, it would be folly to assume that complete separation of powers is even really possible. James Madison himself wrote on this topic in Federalist number 47, using the British Constitution as an example and referring to Montesquieu directly. There will be a quote within a quote here, so I'm assuming most people will be able to pick out where the Montesquieu quote comes in, but Madison wrote, quote, "On the slightest view of the British Constitution, we must perceive that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments are by no means totally separate and distinct from each other. The executive magistrate forms an integral part of the legislative authority. He alone has the prerogative of making treaties with foreign sovereigns, which, when made, have, under certain limitations, the force of legislative acts. All the members of the Judiciary Department are appointed by him, can be removed by him on the address of the two houses of Parliament, and form, when he pleases to consult them, one of his constitutional councils. One branch of the legislative department forms also a great constitutional council to the executive chief, as, on another hand, it is the sole depositary of judicial power in cases of impeachment, and is invested within the supreme appellate jurisdiction in all other cases. The judges, again, are so far connected with the legislative department as often to attend and participate in its deliberations, though not admitted to a legislative vote. From these facts by which Montesquieu was guided, it may clearly be inferred that in saying, "There can be no liberty where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body of magistrates," or, "If the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers," he did not mean that those departments ought to have no partial agency in or no control over the acts of each other. His meaning, and his own words import, and still more conclusively, as illustrated by the example in his eye, can amount to no more than this: that where the whole power of one department is exercised by the same hands which possess the whole power of another department, the fundamental principles of a free constitution are subverted. End quote. Now, this therefore means that while the three main powers of the state must remain as separate and distinct as the human condition will allow, some room must be made for some overlap. However, given the nature of a written constitution, such as ours, the overlapping powers and/or duties must only be those permitted by the Constitution itself or by subsequent amendments thereto. This truth leads to yet another question. Do all the powers and duties of the given branches of government need to be permitted expressly by the Constitution? Again, the answer is no. The terms of art in question, along with the more well-known necessary and proper clause, which, again, we're going to cover later, they are the basis of the American constitutional doctrine of implied powers. It takes little effort to understand that if the founders had rattled off all the powers of the respective branches of government, the Constitution that they would have drafted would have been nearly unfathomably long and complicated. Now, the founders almost certainly understood this, and that is why, even before the current Constitution was drafted and ratified, some of them began to develop the idea of implied or inherent powers, which, as there's a great historian, his name is Forrest MacDonald, he once said that their belief was, quote, that certain powers logically derive from responsibilities, end quote. I took that from a book of his called Novus Ordo Seclorum, The Intellectual Origins of the Constitution. Now also, as has been said before, since the founders were creating the American system of government based on that of England, it's far more likely that at least some of the powers that they were going to permit the government to have would simply be those enjoyed by tradition or custom. Therefore, we can infer almost certainly the meanings of legislative powers, executive powers, and judicial power. Most plainly, they mean those things which the corresponding branch of government is either granted by the Constitution or is assumed to have. Essentially, they are saying, when they say the legislative, executive, or judicial power, they mean nothing more than those things that we're putting into the Constitution or those things that they otherwise would have enjoyed back in England, save for some changes that we're going to make. It's relatively straightforward in that respect. A perfect example of such a power is one which pertains to the judicial branch, namely the power of judicial review. After all, at the Constitutional Convention, and this is a quote from another historian called Walter Burns, B-E-R-N-S. His book is Taking the Constitution Seriously. Again, I highly recommend that book. He has a quote in there which says that at the Constitutional Convention, quote, "There was no dispute concerning the appropriateness of judges exercising what has come to be known as judicial review. That the courts would have this judicial power seems to have been assumed during the course of debate on the measure." End quote. Now, the appropriate use of judicial review we covered a few videos ago, and we don't need to really go into it a whole lot this time once more, but anything left seemingly unclear about these terms at this point we will likely address later in the necessary and proper clause. However, before wrapping up any study of the rightful powers of the respective branches of government, we need not only to know what those powers are, but also need to comprehend how they work and interact within the constitutional framework. It might be best to use an example to demonstrate this elaborate yet delicate, almost ballet of power. The presidency of Federalist John Adams lasted from 1797 to 1801, and during that time he had a Congress full of politically like-minded supporters. Thus, the Congress was able to pass quickly the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, and Adams signed them into law immediately. It was mostly because of these laws that Adams' main opposition, the Jeffersonian Republicans, referred to the second half of his administration as the Federalist Reign of Terror. The actual content of these laws is not really integral to the point being made here, so again, bear with me. Aside from the Congress and the presidency being controlled by Federalists, members of what Thomas E. Woods Jr. would call, he described them as, quote, "a political party that generally favored a strong central government and a broad construction of the Constitution," end quote, meaning that it's not strict construction, it's almost kind of a looser interpretation. The same was true of the judiciary, because, this is to quote Kevin R.C. Gutzman from his book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, quote, "Federal judges in the period from 1798 to 1801 were all Federalists. From the beginning, they had been chosen for their eminence and because they were Federalists," end quote. Now, therefore, when people were tried for having broken these laws, the judiciary usually ruled, in fact, yes, they were guilty. This was because, being of Federalist sympathies, they upheld the Alien and Sedition Acts as perfectly constitutional. Now, by 1800, however, the political winds had shifted in favor of the Jeffersonian Republicans, and in the presidential election of that year, Thomas Jefferson won and was sworn into office in 1801. He started off his presidency by letting victims of the Sedition Act out of jail. That is, he pardoned them. He used the power, the executive power of presidential pardon to essentially say, no, I pardon them of any wrongdoing that they may have done. As a side note, the Sedition Act itself expired on the last day of John Adams' administration, and even though the Alien Enemies Act was never actually repealed, it was never enforced while Jefferson was president. It remains, although nearly forgotten and still unenforced, in effect today. But in light of what we've covered so far, we can ask, okay, so who was wrong in this political situation? Was it the Federalists? Was it the Jeffersonian Republicans? Did the judiciary overstep its bounds? The correct answer here is no one was wrong. That is not to say that constitutional law is relativistic. By no means it's not. Rather, the members of each branch of government acted in accordance with what they perceived to be the correct constitutional procedure. The legislature, that is Congress, passed bills which its members believed did not violate any constitutional provisions. Adams, believing much the same, signed the bills into law and enforced them. The judiciary upheld in the courtroom the acts passed by Congress and signed by the President, because they too believed them to be constitutionally sound. Jefferson, taking over for Adams in 1801, believing that the acts were unconstitutional, pardoned any and all persons convicted under them. Objectively, these bills themselves were either constitutional or not. but each branch was free to handle the bills as they saw fit whenever they or their application came under their respective jurisdictions. Essentially, it's almost like a passing of the baton. Things start with the legislature, they get passed on to, they construct the bill as they would imagine that it should be. They pass on to the president. If he signs it into law, it becomes a law, and he gets to enforce it. Then it comes under his jurisdiction. And if anybody needs to be tried under those laws, again, they move to this. The law moves to the judiciary, who then gets to sit in judgment over the cases brought before them. It is, as historian Andrew C. McLaughlin wrote, that, quote, "It is well to disabuse our minds of the notion that it is the peculiar function of the Supreme Court to pronounce legislative acts void. That court stands in no peculiar relationship to Congress and is not charged with the special and exclusive duty of upholding the Constitution, which is law." End quote. That's from his book, A Constitutional History of the United States. That is, it's not only the job of the Supreme Court to decide whether or not a law is, in fact, constitutional. Every branch of government has a say in that. Even more incisive was McLaughlin's statement that, quote, "If we should examine carefully all of the early decisions, both state and national, we would find frequent emphasis on the coordinate authority of departments and the independence of the judiciary. A court had the power to review and reject an act, not because it was superior to the legislature, not because the court was set up as a body of censors, but because it was entitled to its own independent judgment concerning the meaning of the Constitution and the extent of legislative competence." End quote. Therefore, the true nature of the balance of power in the federal government is this: each branch is supreme within its own sphere of power, and each branch of government has an equal right and duty to determine the constitutionality of a matter for itself. Finally, one can now move on to study the next major term of art, if we go on from there, which would be the General Welfare Clause. But I think, again, I can save that for next time, where we'll pick up on it again. But essentially, this is where we come into a major rift, almost, in modern American politics, where it just seems assumed, by and large, that if any act of Congress is passed, then gets signed into law, it moves to the Supreme Court, or some other federal court, gets to decide whether or not it's constitutional. No, this is absolutely not the case, that they have the exclusive, almost godlike responsibility of determining the constitutionality of acts. The legislature is, in Congress nowadays, is completely directly elected by the people. Again, it used to be before Amendment 17, it used to be that the Senate was indirectly elected. We elected our state governments, and then the state legislatures appointed senators to the Senate. But again, nowadays it's just directly elected. We choose for ourselves who is going to represent us in the legislative body of the United States. The president is also indirectly elected through what's known as the process of election through the Electoral College. Now, again, we notice that the people have some say in deciding who gets to go to the White House and sit in power of executing those laws which their representatives, assuming that they're acting in the interests of their constituencies, have passed into law. You'll notice as soon as you get to the judiciary, they are the most distantly removed branch of government, if you will, from the people, from whom we assume that the elective power comes from. Now, why is it a good idea for some reason that they, a panel of 9 black-robed men and women, theoretically, I mean, even now we have 3 females sitting on the Supreme Court. Why is it that these 9 unelected, black-robed lawyers get to decide what laws we live under? That is not the purpose of freedom in the United States. This is not the purpose of the Constitution. We in America are self-ruled. We get to determine what laws we live under. If we leave these decisions up to the Supreme Court, they get to decide what laws we live under, then we are no longer free. And this in a sense, means that we would, if we entrusted the Supreme Court to sit in judgment over all of the laws that our duly elected representatives in Congress passed, and our duly elected president has signed into law and is now enforcing, if they get to decide what laws we live under, our freedom is completely usurped, and we become nothing more than wards of the state. Now, I think that this much is almost blatantly obvious once it's laid out. And a lot of people have the, at least somewhat, almost knee-jerk reaction to object if a law that has been passed they disagree with, like say they're in the minority and they didn't get their representative put in Congress. They essentially have someone whose ideas are not lined up with their own, pass a law. They find a particular law to be unconstitutional or unfavorable to them. All of a sudden, if it does ever make its way to the Supreme Court for review, the Supreme Court nowadays supposedly has the power to strike down laws, and that is in fact not the case. As we previously discussed, people will, at least they somehow almost rejoice in saying, oh good, they struck down that law, it's now null and void. We can essentially just raise our voices and say, excuse me, Supreme Court, who the hell are you? These people cannot, the people who are almost joyous when a Supreme Court decision is made that strikes down a law that they find unfavorable, don't understand that that is essentially tyranny in its rawest form. That a body of censors, essentially, gets to decide who rules whom, essentially. They sit in judgment over us almost as kings. And this is something that we cannot tolerate. Now, obviously, we know that the only way to remove a judge from a federal post is through impeachment, conviction, and then outright removal from office. But I would just ask that everybody keep in mind that, for instance, if a bill goes through Congress that were, say, to, this is just a wild example, that were to force mandatory abortions on women, and is signed by a president and then goes to the Supreme Court, if they strike down the law, there would be people who would celebrate the decision. And again, while that act, in this instance, is almost, there's really only a handful of people who would not agree that that is just an egregious abuse of power and just not permitted by the Constitution. Even then, we cannot just celebrate the fact that the law has been struck down. It is, in fact, it's almost disturbing, really, that such a small minority of people, that is just 9 justices sitting on a bench, get to decide that for us. Now, again, whether or not they made a good decision in deeming that law null and void, whether or not that's a good thing, objectively or not, we still have to correct the wrong by ousting the people who are currently in Congress who passed that law through the elective process, and then have them repeal that law, or have a president, again through the elective process, who would either not enforce the law and then wait for the legislative body to repeal it. We have to go through the election process and the proper channels to getting unjust laws undone. We cannot simply leave it to the federal judiciary to take care of for us, I suppose is a nice way of summing up what I'm trying to say. I suppose that's it for now. Again, like I said before, we'll pick up next time with the general welfare clause, and oh, what a train wreck that is. It's going to be fun. All right, I suppose I can let you go now. I thank you all for watching, and I will see you again next time. All right, bye-bye.